That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Amy, any other question? Dr. Jackson, thank you so much for driving down and taking time out of your day. It's always a joy to hear from you. Thank you so much for presenting.
All right. Thank you kindly. The Lord bless you one and all.
Thank you. Amy, who's
Okay.
next?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next up, we have Dr. Matt Clark, and I'm doing double duty, so I'm going to run full of presentation.
Dr. Clark, while you're coming, I just want to thank you for presenting. And can we ask questions along the way if need to, or you want us to wait till the end?
Yes, sir. I would just say that my answer is the same as the other fellow.
Okay.
As long as the time restraints are a little bit looser, because I got a lot to say. I probably put too much in my presentation.
Okay.
Thank you for having me here and giving us a chance to talk to you. It's very important.
No problem. We just have, we have Dr. DeVoe coming behind you, and then we've got to get DHEC in here before too late.
You're okay with that
I can
format?
move it. Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to provide testimony on what I consider to be a very critical topic. I don't know if I've faced anything in my life that's this important. I don't know if I've read about anything in the history of our world that's this important. And I'm thankful for your foresight to plan ahead. It demonstrates the kind of leadership that can help achieve optimal public health goals in the case of future epidemics. I'm going to kind of go through some key points on the front end, things to consider, and then kind of a chronology, and just kind of share with you my head-scratching moments along the way and how this whole course of events led to where I am today and how I had to go through all of this to get to where I am now. I gained my medical degree in 1995 from the Medical College of Georgia, and I was awarded membership in AOA. I hope you won't hold the Georgia thing against me. And you go, okay, here we go. And I was a member of the National Medical Honor Society during medical school. I received my master's in public health in 2008 from the Harvard School of Public Health. And I've been the sole business owner and practicing physician of my allergy, asthma, and immunology medical practice since 2008. I'm board certified in pediatrics and allergy, asthma, and immunology. In the past, I was board certified in aerospace medicine after completing the U.S. Navy's public health residency in aerospace medicine. Aerospace medicine focuses upon practicing public health within the context of aviation and aerospace occupations. Occupational medicine is a subset of public health medicine. Also, I'm a Christian pastor. I was ordained in 2014, and I've been pastoring the same church in Edgefield, South Carolina since even before that time. I'm a husband to the best wife in the world. I'm the father of 11 wonderful children, and I'm the grandfather of 3 perfect granddaughters. Also, I'm the executive director of Personhood South Carolina, a statewide pro-life organization devoted to restoring equal legal protection to every baby in South Carolina, beginning at conception and without exception. During the coronavirus pandemic, leading a medical clinic and a church required almost daily assessments of a wide array of data with ongoing real-time decision-making and frequent reassessments along the way. As a result of drinking from these fire hoses, I observed, experienced, and interpreted many important narrative points and policy decisions along the way. Today, I will endeavor by God's grace to present to you an accurate picture of this topic as I understand it at this time. And based upon this understanding, I'll make some recommendations for your consideration. To me, it seems like the big picture strategic view that I'm going to share, I've come to, is probably the most important thing because it will guide in ways that are very critical, in my view. Here's my thesis. I cannot find a scientific or medical explanation for the course of events that I've observed since March of 2020. I'm left to other areas of study and experience to find my explanations. My biblical worldview, with its particular understandings regarding human nature, the ultimate questions of life, and the ultimate battles of life, has been essential to remaining with an open mind in my search for these answers. I find myself, frankly, deeply saddened by my current understanding, but if it is true, and I believe it is, it really needs to be vocalized for all to hear. For the good of my fellow Americans, I believe we have an unfolding tragedy on our hand. It's my position that our national public health agencies have forfeited their credibility via their decisions and their deep and long-term conflicts of interest with the trillion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. There may be other conflicts of interest. These I'm confident of. So for South Carolina, I believe we face a dual threat. We need to be prepared for both the threat of future infectious pandemics and the threat of attendant deluge of propaganda and bullying likely to accompany any future pandemics as well. So as we look back, it's important for us, I think, to see the need to understand what has really happened, what the reality of the situation was at that time as best as we can in order to prepare for the future. I've attempted to include only the most pertinent information, and each point was included for the purpose of making recommendations for the future, so please bear this in mind as I proceed. I've got a lot to say. Each point has its place leading to my recommendations. First of all, good science requires authentic scholars. What does this mean? Scientific inquiry uses a logical process to gain accurate information about a particular aspect of observable reality. The reliability of this information is directly related to both the scientific skill and the honesty of the investigator. Authentic scholars with a deep background, they have expertise, and a solid backbone, they have character, they have a fighting chance to report truth that can help others. Conversely, compromised investigators and leaders immediately bring likely insurmountable doubt upon their studies and their policy recommendations. This quest for a better and better understanding of observable reality for the good of our neighbors drives good scientists to learn and practice good science, including good medicine and public health. Physician scholars walk this path one patient at a time through interpersonal interactions, history, physical examination, diagnostic testing, medical decision-making, management recommendations, and then ongoing follow-up to see how things are going. Were there problems? Were there side effects? Now, this one-on-one healing process can be very complex, surrounded with uncertainty. It's filled with uncertainty. But the level of uncertainty is somewhat limited because we're only dealing with one person at a time. Now, when we do this, our first priority must always be first, do no harm. And that's been violated throughout the course of this pandemic. Now, public health scholars walk a similar path as physicians, but their patient is a particular population, such as Edgefield County or the state of South Carolina, or in my case, in the past, a helicopter training squadron. And their history and physical involves careful acquisition and monitoring of accurate population data, these health indices, such as infection rates and death rates and things of that nature. And then the public health physician needs to, through a process of decision-making that weighs the potential efficacy, risk, benefits, and alternatives of the public health interventions that are under consideration. The same kind of decision-making has to be done. And these professionals are responsible to know the potential side effects and downsides of their recommendations. And then ongoing monitoring is necessary to assess success, failure, adverse events, and unexpected outcomes. They're supposed to know what to look for and how to look for it when they make recommendations. The complexities and uncertainties of public health efforts are often vast and very significant, far beyond the uncertainty that we deal with one patient at a time. Just like typical outpatient or inpatient physicians, good public health experts also adhere to the highest priority of medicine, first, do no harm. They had a virtually impossible job. I have great compassion, especially state-level leaders who are trying to make decisions in this fast-moving environment. Nevertheless, they must know and anticipate and closely monitor as best they can for ways that their recommendations could backfire and make the cure worse than the disease, which is always the worst thing that a healer would ever want to see. A word about complexity and uncertainty. Most of the questions surrounding the coronavirus pandemic involve multiple overlapping sources of complexity and uncertainty. We have to, in order to be pros at this, we have to deal with uncertainty properly. And it's in this context that the public health professional is most challenged. Infectious disease pandemics are often fast-moving events that tempt decision makers to minimize complexity and uncertainty, embrace oversimplified answers, and promote insufficiently considered policies. Surely even great expertise and proven character can sometimes be outmatched by an accelerating complex and uncertain pandemic situation. So we really need to have compassion on our state-level public health leaders who were misled and browbeat by federal agencies. But now that we've seen the schemes, we can make plans to protect South Carolinians from future misguided federal public health policies. A word about dogmatism and division. When an oversimplified answer is promoted as if it is absolutely true, when the presence of complexity and uncertainty is minimized, and when public policies are promulgated within this context of false certainty, then dogmatism has defeated rational thought. When this occurs, especially if public health and media messaging involves mocking and marginalizing and threatening dissenting voices, then the public health leaders behind this are guilty of manipulating and dividing individuals from one another. They're practicing propaganda, not science, as you've heard. And in my bibliography, you'll see a book about propaganda. And if you look at that, you will see that the things that have been occurring are according to these doctrines of propaganda that were set down a long time ago. They know what they're doing. I think you can see where I'm coming from. I don't think it's an accident. I don't think it was just incompetence. Surely even an untrained mind can quickly imagine all the public health indices that will worsen because of population polarization and discord. We saw that, didn't we? If violent crimes, suicide, divorce, abuse, mental illness, and other conflict-associated public health problems worsen, then the public health leader behind these oversimplified, dogmatic, divisive policies has broken the physician's first maxim, and that is to first do no harm. We must stand against unnecessary polarization. We've got to work together. Don't take the bait, right? Don't be provoked. We're all in this together. We must stand against unnecessary polarization while insisting upon discovering the reality of this situation. And much of the messaging was intentionally polarizing. Separate people. Keep them from coming together. Keep them from awakening together to the reality of what they're going through. So to love our neighbors as ourselves, we cannot allow this to be about politics or anything else other than just looking after one another. Public unity as fellow human beings is critical to our future success, and I believe that you as elected officials have a voice towards that. Avoiding divisive decisions and messaging should always be a top priority. Seeking informed consent and full disclosure of conflicts of interests must remain intact while displaying courtesy and respect to one another. A word about the comprehensive nature of these considerations if they're going to be good. When a public health intervention is implemented, there are a wide array of potential unintended consequences, known and some unknown. For example, it's been observed that increases in unemployment correlate with increases in death rates. Were all the potential concurrent and future public health consequences of aggressive non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as lockdown and school closures, fully considered? Or did a myopic focus only upon reducing case counts cloud their judgment? That's what I observed. It looked to me like clouded, myopic decision-making. Let's talk about the types of evidence that are out there and being consistent. Different types of evidence have differing levels of certainty associated with them. Biological plausibility based upon animal studies will never be as convincing as a good randomized controlled clinical trial. Hence, the strength of a recommendation must be tempered by the level of certainty of the evidence underlying the recommendation. Also, consistency and application of this standard must be applied to every question. For example, why were promising pre-existing outpatient medications rejected simply because they lacked randomized clinical trials, while masks were recommended for public use, even though multiple prior good quality studies demonstrated questionable efficacy? This was one of my first head scratchers. Observant scholars scratch their heads and wonder what is really going on when you see something like this, especially from these people who are very intelligent and well-read, and they know these things far better than I do. Reinterpreting what we experienced. I think this first point is important, and it needs to be considered throughout the remainder of the events that we went through. The SARS-CoV-2 origins cover-up. The SARS-CoV-2 virus was almost certainly created within the Wuhan Institute of Virology and was partially funded by money from the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, a department within the NIH. In addition, American scientists helped create the virus, as you've seen in previous lectures, and at least one NIH-funded American nonprofit also helped, EcoHealth Alliance. Studies published in the U.S. medical literature revealed the NIAID funding and the American scientists working together with the nonprofit and with Chinese scientists from the Wuhan Institute of Virology. You saw that earlier already. This all occurred despite the Obama-era moratorium on gain-of-function research. I think that came in 2014. The initial story of wet market origins via natural selection was highly dubious even early in 2020, and so NIH leadership took steps to quiet the story about the origins being in Wuhan. Some of the scientists in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, some of the scientists who wrote the key cover-up article have received large grants from the NIH. Now, even Dr. Robert Redfield, who was the head of the CDC at that time, confirmed this as a cover-up later when he said, I think we have to really recognize that there was a real attempt by the leadership of NIH and some of the major scientists across the world to cover up the fact that this virus was in fact a consequence of science. He described their actions as an aggressive attempt to stifle any discussion. Dr. Anthony Fauci, the main public health leader involved in the Wuhan origins cover-up, also went on to oversee or greatly influence the federal public health response in America throughout the entire pandemic. So everything you see from this point forward, remember that. This shocking fact places insurmountable doubt upon the federal pandemic response and should influence how we interpret every federal policy measure as we go through this and in the future. The meticulously researched and documented book by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., The Real Anthony Fauci, is a bombshell that every American needs to read. And it meticulously documents 50 years of similar shocking character concerns from the leader of NIAID. I urge you to read it. Next, reinterpreting what we experienced, inaccurate tests and multiple counts. This gets to the idea that we didn't really know what was going on at the time, and we were acting with more confidence than we should have. In January 2020, German physician Dr. Christian Drosten and colleagues published a study claiming they had developed an accurate PCR test to diagnose COVID-19. PCR tests can detect tiny amounts of DNA or RNA via numerous cycles of copying and increasing the amount of DNA or RNA that is present. This multiple cycle process is called amplification. Positive and negative testing for a PCR test is established based upon a predetermined number of maximum amplification cycles. This is the test's maximum cycle threshold. If the test remains negative after the predefined maximum number of cycles, then the test is considered negative. The Drosten PCR test was rolled out worldwide in early 2020 with a maximum cycle threshold of 45. An external peer review published in November of 2020 by 23 scientists, including some who have patents related to PCR or DNA isolation and sequencing, and a former Pfizer chief scientists, identified numerous flaws in the Drosten article. They concluded that an analytical result with a cycle threshold value of 45 is scientifically and diagnostically absolutely meaningless. Now, we don't know, we don't have enough data to know whether most of the folks hit positive at 25 or 35 or 45. But if most of them were up towards 45, diagnostically meaningless. Yet the results of this dubious test served as the major source of coronavirus infection data used to guide the worldwide pandemic response. Let that sink in. In addition, some protocols involve multiple tests in the same patient, and some patients would seek more tests after the first positive test. Thus, one infection could lead to multiple positive tests. So these are just two of the ways that the numbers were inflated. Now, I'm not claiming that this inaccurate testing or multiple counts made something out of nothing, but rather the data presented an exaggerated picture of the problem, and anyone who faces this in the future has got to be constantly aware of the possibility of this reality so that they don't get walked down the primrose path of agreeing to these aggressive non-pharmaceutical interventions that we suffered through, and we suffered through unnecessarily. Reinterpreting what we experienced, financial incentives for positive COVID tests. You've heard this already today multiple times. Repetition is good for us. Hospitalized patients who tested positive for SARS-CoV-2 were counted as COVID hospitalization cases regardless of why they were in the hospital. In addition, the CDC guidance stated, in cases where a definitive diagnosis of COVID cannot be made, but is suspected or likely, it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate as probable or presumed. This is fairly reasonable, but the big financial incentive for hospitals must be considered when we are gauging accuracy of hospital-reported data. The CARES Act created a 20% add-on to be paid for Medicare patients with COVID-19. The Act further created a $100 billion fund that was used to financially assist hospitals. A portion of this fund was designed to be used to reimburse providers for COVID-19 care of the uninsured. The U.S. government paid hospitals for doing COVID-19 tests, for admitting COVID-19 positive patients, and the full daily Medicare hospitalization rate, plus the 20% add-on. regardless of their insurance status. Now, bear in mind, the hospitals would receive all this money even if the hospitals did nothing for the patient except place them in a room and provide the most basic care. Now, but to make matters worse, in November of 2020, the U.S. government then began paying an extra 20% on top of all of this to hospitals that utilized new FDA-approved drugs to treat COVID-19. Medicare paid this extra 20% on top of the already 20% augmented hospital bill whenever remdesivir was used. Instead of mocking the possibility of false data emerging from this financial arrangement, a prudent public health official would acknowledge the prior evidence of financial incentives driving up healthcare costs and thus skewing public health data. Again, this is not to say that this incentive created something out of nothing, but rather the data we received at the time surely gave an exaggerated picture of the problem. Reinterpreting what we experienced. Inaccurate modeling influenced public health policy. This is really important. You remember the Imperial College London and everyone's panicking about it? It was very effective at creating fear in the population and in the leaders. The Imperial College London model predicted on March 16, 2020, that over 1.6 million Americans would die from COVID-19 if aggressive non-pharmaceutical interventions such as lockdowns and school closures were not adopted. The actual number 1 year later was around 560,000. But based upon what we've already heard, that number is also surely inflated. Some have argued that it was American lockdowns and school closures that avoided the large death toll in America. But of interest, the same modeling principles of the Imperial College of London model were used to estimate deaths, predict deaths in Sweden in early 2020 as well. This is helpful because Sweden did not implement the recommended aggressive NPIs and ended up having death outcomes better than or comparable to other European nations and a better economic outcome than all the other European nations and avoided the negative public health outcomes of aggressive NPIs, which are well known, and I mentioned them earlier. In any case, from this point forward, aggressive NPIs are presented. So here we are in the story going along. At that point in time, every aggressive NPIs are presented as the only good options until the vaccine arrives. Stay home and wait for the vaccine. Even though reports of promising repurposed medications had emerged in the literature in February. A quick word about masks. The most gracious interpretation of the current data is that general public non-respirator masking, that's surgical masks or cloth masks, is unlikely to add benefit during a pandemic, but some studies have shown potential modest benefit. This data goes back many decades, and this is why the CDC and the World Health Organization both recommended against public mask usage early on in the pandemic. Why they changed their mind when they did was another decision that did not make any sense to me at that time, especially given their stridency and the subsequent mask mandates. Subsequent data specific to COVID-19 that came out later, because the prior data was based on basically influenza illnesses usually. Subsequent data specific to COVID-19 has been consistent with what we already knew before about the pandemic. Public masking is unlikely to offer benefit. In addition, masks have a list of known negative physical and mental health outcomes for the wearers, especially children, and have obviously served as a visible item that can quickly divide us from one another when we greatly need public unity. And I believe this was done on purpose as a part of the propaganda campaign. It is a well-known part of propaganda. Reinterpreting what we experienced. What was the infection fatality rate? We had a case fatality rate of 2 to 4% from the early data out of China. Now, this is a scary number. That should get your attention. That should make you say, when did the lockdown start? If it's really a 4% infection fatality rate. Fortunately, subsequent infection prevalence data combined with vulnerability data showed the overall COVID-19 infection fatality rate between 0.075%, that's 1 in 1,300, and 0.28%, that's 1 in 360 in the U.S. So at worst, this is about 5 times the IFR, that's the infection fatality rate, for seasonal influenza. So it's worse than seasonal influenza. And this IFR is comparable to the U.S. influenza epidemics that we had in 57 and 68 and the British influenza epidemics of the late 90s, comparable IFRs. No lockdowns occurred during those epidemics. It is not true that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was or is a highly lethal pathogen for the general population. It's a very important maxim in understanding what we went through. We were led to believe that this was a highly lethal pathogen for the general population. That was not true. And we had enough data at the time to know that. That's why folks like me and others recommended selective protection, and I'll get to that. For the elderly and the sick, yes, it was very dangerous, but especially for the young and healthy, it was not a highly lethal pathogen. March 13th, 2020, I remember this day almost like it was yesterday. Based upon data from China and Italy at that time, we knew the virus was much more dangerous for the elderly and the sick, and we knew that containment efforts had failed. So it was out in the general population, it was moving, we weren't going to stop it, we weren't going to contain it. The virus was spreading through the world population despite multinational quarantine efforts. Astute public health professionals knew it was simply a matter of time before this respiratory virus spread throughout the world population, and that total societal lockdown was sure to fail and make public health indices even worse via the subsequent economic catastrophe. The good news was that the virus appeared to have a very low morbidity mortality rate amongst the young and healthy, so we had found its Achilles heel. So I made recommendation to the Edgefield County leadership at that time. I was invited to the Edgefield County Development Council meeting that day, and I advised them to focus on protecting the vulnerable while keeping the younger and healthier population working. This approach had obvious advantage, and this is the same approach that Sweden took. This would buy us time to find effective early treatment. This would protect economic stability. This would continue educational progress for children and young adults. It would prevent hospital system overload, and it would increase population immunity amongst the young and healthy, which would decrease the risk for the vulnerable over time and allow time for viral attenuation, which would also protect the vulnerable once they stopped isolating. The Great Barrington Declaration came out on October 5th, 2023, made this same basic point, and they were attacked and vilified swiftly in the press. In addition, we were fed doubts about natural immunity over and over again early on in this, and prior data regarding coronavirus infection, there was no reason for us to have such doubt. There was some uncertainty, granted, but not the level that we were exposed to. But then, boom, March 16, the narrative begins. They're rolling out the new clinical trial for the mRNA vaccine, and it becomes the presented positively every time, and it's the best and only treatment option that we're presented with from that point forward. And that's where the narrative really started running through. Stay home and wait for the vaccine. Here's the early outpatient therapy story briefly stated. February 2020, reports from China and South Korea suggested HCQ was effective. Then on March 4th, 2020, one of the world's heroes, Didier Raoult from France, he put this article out, or he did an initial article, talked about their promise, and then he put this article out, and you can see in the green there, day 6, PCR negative, 100% in the treated group, control group, 90% still positive day 6. This was picked up by another hero, Zev Zelenko, who added zinc, and he used the cocktail successfully in 141 of his high-risk patients. When I heard about this, I called his office. I talked to one of his nurses sometime around this time. I don't know exactly when it was. And I said, is this true? Is this really? She's like, oh, yeah, this is happening, and they're getting better. So I called up there, and after that, I started implementing this myself in my practice. Subsequent early outpatient studies have proven time and time again that this regimen was safe and effective. You see those green dots there? All those dots show us the effectiveness of HCQ, okay? Later in April 2020, ivermectin arose as another promising early outpatient treatment, and there are its accolades right there. The people who discovered this medicine, they won the Nobel Prize for Medicine. Did you know that? And it's been given, more than 3.7 billion treatments have been distributed throughout the world. Both this medicine and HCQ are on the World Health Organization's essential medicine list. But suddenly they become so dangerous. And suddenly we start getting this message about how dangerous it is. It's purely propaganda. There were also a bunch of other medications that were discovered. Simple stuff, vitamin D, zinc, metformin, vitamin C. And all of these showed efficacy against this virus. It turns out it's eminently treatable early with many things that are available over the counter. Now, another thing you got to take note of is the corruption in the medical journals. The Surgisphere Corporation submitted fraudulent data, and a study was published in Lancet saying that HCQ is dangerous. They retracted it, but the damage was done, and you'd asked earlier about studies, a number of those studies on HCQ were withdrawn at that time. In addition, they did some studies, but they were all inpatient, and the dosing was terrible, and they showed no effect or they showed danger. This is just more of the head scratchers for me. I couldn't figure out what was going on. And everything that I've been through since that time has continued to confirm my conclusion regarding the early outpatient therapy story. A lot of our fellow Americans have very likely died unnecessarily because of those public health decisions, and in the most terrible way, stuck alone in a room where they couldn't communicate with their family. This is what's been done to us. Now, I'm not alone on this. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, representing thousands of physicians across America, take the same stand. In addition, world-renowned scientists and scholars such as Peter McCullough, Robert Malone, Harvey Risch, you can see their names there. The list goes on and on. Contrary to what has been claimed, the decisions by our public health leaders have not been based upon science or uncontested consensus. So what's really going on? There can't be consensus if there hasn't been a conversation. They block prescriptions in outpatient and outpatient settings. You know this, you saw this. I heard Dr. Jackson's testimony last year. I experienced the same thing with the pharmacies. Thank God for independent pharmacists who have the backbone to do what is right. We would be in a lot of trouble. There'd be a lot more dead people, I believe, if it weren't for those independent pharmacists. After they attack the ideas, first they ignore, then they block, then they attack, then they replace with something else. And then if that doesn't work, they go on to attack the person. And they bring threats and attacks against the person. Now, to my knowledge, no physicians or pharmacists in South Carolina have been threatened or had their licenses revoked. But there have been individuals who had their licenses attacked over this. And Dr. Peter McCullough, the American Board of Internal Medicine, shame on them. They removed his certifications for internal medicine and cardiology, one of the most decorated scientists in the world before this happened. Just a section there about the attack on the influential dissenters, just another example of the propaganda. The Fifth Circuit judges on the censorship suit against two of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. So the censorship did happen, and it turns out, I guess it was a conspiracy because it was between the FBI and the White House working together with the social media companies. And then came the vaccines, and I'm going to beg for a little bit more time because this is really important. Fauci said that's the worst possible thing you could do is vaccinate somebody to prevent infection and actually make them worse. They knew about antibody-dependent enhancement beforehand. We've all known about it. Anyone in this field, we know about it. And it was seen in the dengue virus when they tried to vaccinate the dengue virus folks and children who'd never had it before. They died at a higher rate. And these antibodies, they do bind to the infection when you get it, but they make the infection worse. So anyone watching the VAERS data knew that a very serious safety signal was emerging by mid-2021.
Dr. Clark.
Real quick, I have to emphasize this. The initial study was stopped at 6 months and unblinded, and the control group was vaccinated. So we'll never be able to know from that original study about so many different things regarding the vaccines. There again, you've seen that same graph. Let me just scan through here a couple quick points.
Dr. Clark, I just had one question.
Sure.
I have Dr. DeVore coming after you. Dr. DeVore, how long is your presentation?
10, 15 minutes.
Oh, okay. Because we got to get DHEC in here at 4:30. So if you could wrap it up, maybe 5 more minutes would be okay. Thank you.
The FDA has used misleading statistical statements to try to distract people from what's going on with VAERS, right? And they don't allow autopsies to take place. They discouraged autopsies for vaccine adverse events. So the question is, what about the autopsies? The CDC refused to recommend autopsies on deaths that were reported to VAERS, and that omission allowed the agency to repeatedly make the audacious, fraudulent declaration that all the 16,000 reported deaths following vaccination by October 2021 were unrelated to the vaccines, even though they had done no causal analysis studies. The regulatory agencies thereby abolished vaccine deaths and injuries by fiat, and this is a true statement. We do have, let me just suffice it to say, we have autopsy data that is very convincing that these vaccines are causing these deaths, that it's not just a statistical anomaly. And interestingly, one study that included Dr. Peter McCullough as an author showed that a total of 240 deaths were independently adjudicated as directly due to or significantly contributed to by the COVID-19 infection. That's 74% in that study. Now, of note, it was initially published on Lancet, but they pulled it down. And I had to go to Wayback Machine to find a copy of it. Life insurance data, CDC data, BLS data shows increase in all-cause mortality. You've seen that. It matches exactly what we've seen. In addition, when you go back and look at the original Pfizer data, there were more people that died in the treatment group than in the control group. Have you ever heard that before? There were more people that died in the treatment group than in the control group. But there was one less person that died of COVID. And so that's what they focused their efforts on when they promoted that data. And in fact, when you look at the data from Pfizer, it also gave us a signal regarding cardiovascular deaths as well in those who were vaccinated, a 4 or 5 to 1 risk of cardiovascular deaths in that time frame compared to the unvaccinated. Why did ACOG, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecologists, recommend COVID vaccines for pregnant women when the original Pfizer trial did not include pregnant women? They didn't have any data. How could they do that? Same with children in terms of the risks to children. Multiple agencies throughout the world and doctors all over the world are calling for this vaccine to be removed from the market. There is not a consensus on the safety and the efficacy of this vaccine. And I use the word vaccine just for ease of communication. I understand the controversy there. They've been modestly effective for about 6 months, but then it wanes, and ultimately we're not able to stop infections well enough to prevent transmission. We all know that. And looks like the vaccinated might be more likely to have a severe outcome. Now, sadly, our South Carolina DHEC continues to walk in lockstep with the unwarranted federal recommendations regarding these vaccines, stating, I looked at the website today, COVID-19 vaccines are safe and effective. And get this, a local pastor and his wife, whom I know, they were unable to continue as a foster family because of our state's vaccine requirements for foster families. How sad is that? There's an action item for you. That's something that you can work on. Maybe you can fix that. My conclusion. So we were misled by our federal government regarding viral origins, regarding natural immunity, regarding population immunity, selective protection, case numbers, death numbers, modeling predictions, the need for aggressive economy-wrecking NPIs, early outpatient therapies, masks, vaccine safety and vaccine efficacy, and simultaneously, anyone with great influence who dared speak up too loudly and resist the narrative was threatened, mocked, censored, and attacked by government agencies, media, certification boards, and licensing boards. Open dialogue was prohibited, and those who attempted it faced ad hominem attacks and were equated with terrorists. This is why I believe we face a dual threat. You can see the quote there from RFK Jr. He basically says the same thing in his observations. So, to my recommendations. As a Christian pastor, I must say that the wise will recognize that this is primarily a spiritual battle. We do not fight against flesh and blood. If we do not repent and return to the Lord and then humbly implement His designed tools for spiritual battle, there truly is no hope. Unless God fights this battle, as we fight this battle in the name of Christ and for His glory, our labor is indeed in vain. But if we do this in His name, there is limitless hope. The web of corruption and deceit appears too great for any mere human efforts. I don't think we're going to get out of this without God's help. The cancer is too far advanced for only human cures. I hope each of you will deeply consider that. I know that you probably will and probably already have. So policy recommendations. There needs to be predefined criteria to categorize pandemic threats that refuses to grant status of a highly lethal pathogen to anything without very high confidence in the available data. This can require intimate knowledge of every data source and modeling algorithms. We have to have someone in there who knows their craft, who's an expert in these things. Only highly lethal pathogens should even be considered as possible candidates for aggressive NPIs. Aggressive NPIs cannot continue beyond a predefined length of time without vote approval by the House, the Senate, and the governor. Allowing the governor to continue the string of emergency declarations was a big mistake, in my opinion. Even if it was technically legal, it certainly did not stand up to the sniff test, and I want to know how much money we got from the federal government during that time frame. That's what y'all need to be looking into and finding out the strings that were being pulled there. I think it's probably best for South Carolina to have a Surgeon General who is a member of the President's cabinet for greater accountability than we currently ought to have. Because I think the fellow down in Florida, he's demonstrating this kind of expertise and backbone. He stood up last week and recommended against the boosters that were about to come out. He recommended last year against vaccines for young males. He's recommended against the vaccines for children. He stood up and did this inside their state and made those recommendations. And look, I have great compassion for all those who were in DHEC during this pandemic. But it is, in my opinion, it is a sad reality that their choices permanently taint their trustworthiness on these matters. This is nothing personal. This is just the sad fact of the situation. New personnel need to be put in place who have a clean slate and who understand the dual threat that we face and who have the deep scientific background and solid character backbone necessary to be led by the data instead of simply assenting to federal guidance. Got to look into the flow of dollars. Mask mandates for respiratory viruses should never occur again in our state. Lockdowns amid data uncertainty should never occur again in our state. School closures amid data uncertainty should never occur again in our state. And it must be a standing maximum in our state's public policy decision-making that the federal government public health agencies have forfeited their credibility until trust is reestablished through years of reliable scientific guidance disconnected from trillion-dollar conflicts of interest. Perhaps a committee you could form to look into it. There's other things there for you. So thank you for letting me get through that.
So much. Do I have any questions from the committee? Well,
Mr. Chairman, I just want to thank Dr. Clark for preparing such a meticulous document. Incredible preparation there. I'll just say personally, he was the first person I called about the COVID pandemic because I knew he would have to deal with it both as an allergist and as a pastor. And in my first conversation, I discovered something I didn't know, which is that he has a master's in public health, which I found reassuring. And one thing you might have missed was he gave recommendations to Edgefield in the first month of the pandemic about what should be done that have stood the test of time. And I recall the conversation we had that very same day when I called him, emphasizing protecting the elderly without disrupting the lives of those who are not, at great risk. And I would just have to say what we did in public education in this state, we knew within just a short period of time that COVID was not a great threat to young people. And what we did in destroying a year of education for a lot of our students, I just don't have words for it. Us keeping kids out of school. And I think the testing is going to show that over time. But thank you, Dr. Clark.
Well, Dr. Clark, thank you. I believe your presentation did a marvelous job from conception of Wuhan through the recommendations of encapsulating everything that this committee has been about today. So please make sure that gets submitted into the documentation. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. We'll be praying for you all.
Thank you so much. That helps more than anything. Our last presenter is Amy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our final presenter is Dr. Karen DeVore.
Thank you, Dr. DeVore. I'll ask one last time. Can we ask questions along the way, or should we wait till the end?
You can ask whatever you'd like.
Okay, thank you so much.
I want to say good afternoon. I want to thank all of you all for the privilege of speaking up for medical freedom for both physicians and patients in this state. Y'all have heard a lot of information today, and y'all have been very attentive, and you've asked great questions. And I don't know that I have a whole lot more to say than what has been reiterated already, but I'm going to try to make this personal. My name is Karen DeVore. I have been practicing dermatology in Spartanburg, South Carolina for over 30 years. I have a high volume practice. I see about 50 patients a day. I have been prescribing hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. They've been safe, they've been effective, they've been affordable, and I've been prescribing them for over 30 years. Every time I've written the drug for 30 years, it was off label. I have not treated malaria